My name is Chris Cochrane. I'm one of the directors of solution engineering at CyberArk. I'm actually based in Victoria, BC, so it's a nice trip, minus the wind, on the way over the slope lane. My role at CyberArk is actually twofold. First, I do pre-sales. And so what this means is organizations that are looking at privileged access management solutions, they come to me and the sales team, and technically I work with them to see how it fits within their organization, or if it's a fit. On the flip side, though, I also get to work with post-sales. And the benefit of that is after somebody's implemented CyberArk in their environment, I get to see how it's working for them. And as they start their digital transformation journey to things like DevOps and to the cloud, they look to figure out a way CyberArk would work for them. And so the intent of this session is really threefold for me. So the first one is I want people to understand what privileged access management is. So when I talk to folks, and a lot of people came up to the booth and I asked them, do you know what CyberArk is? Do you know about privileged access management? I get kind of the awkward head nod, like I don't want to say I don't, but if I say SIEM solution or I say firewall, everybody understands what that means. Like that's crystal clear. And so we're going to start with what is privileged access management. What does a privileged access management solution look like? Like what would it actually do for your organization? And then once we have that foundation and those fundamentals, how do you apply that to the cloud and to DevOps? And so the goal is to be a bit more prescriptive than maybe a lot of the other presentations. I want people to leave here and then go back to their organization and say, okay, what are we doing here? You might not have a solution, or maybe you do today, but what are we doing and can we do things better? Okay. Now I like that there's a lot of people. It's always sometimes unfortunate too, because I like questions throughout. And everybody gets a bit shy. Maybe there's prizes if you ask a question. There isn't, but let's just pretend like there is. Honestly, ask as many questions as you want. This session is for you folks, right? I'm already tired of hearing myself talk, so come on in, everyone. Most basic question. What is a privileged account? Right? So a privileged account means something different to everyone you speak to. So I work with organizations in oil and gas. I just had a call with somebody that's looking to manage privilege on OT devices in a substation, and they're trying to figure out the way they have to get there with a snowmobile. That's privilege to them. But if I talk to a developer, privilege might be a secret. It might be something in GitHub. It might be something in code. If I talk to an administrator, it might be a Windows local administrative account. Right? So it means something to everyone. And so you can loosely group privileged accounts into, I say, 3 buckets. So the first one is an elevated personal account. And so what does this mean? This means that if you log into your laptop today at work or at school and you type in your credentials, it's probably going to be like your last name. For me, it's Cochrane. Right? But if I wanted to connect to a server or I wanted to connect to some piece of infrastructure, it would be a secondary credential. Cochrane-admin, Cochrane_A. Right? And we have that credential boundary in place for a reason. Right? I want to make sure that if my local account or my personal account is compromised, I can't easily use that credential to move it to to infrastructure. So if you guys don't have that scenario today, where you have that credential boundary, that's like number one. Do that. I've worked with very large organizations, and we had people checking their email with domain admin credentials. That was just attached to their personal account. So it's hygiene 101. So an elevated personal account, we know what that is. The second type of credential would be a shared privileged account, right? And so, as it sounds, it's not tied to an identity. We can't put multi-factor on it. And it comes on absolutely every piece of infrastructure or a service that you subscribe to. There's always going to be a built-in credential. And we use that credential usually to start the implementation. So if I use a very basic example, if I were to buy a physical server, not that anybody does that anymore, but if I were to buy a physical server and I were to put it in a data center, I would have a credential on its out-of-band management card, right, built in. Then I would layer my operating system and I'd have credentials on there, right, local administrator root accounts. And then from there I'd layer my applications and they'd all have credentials, right? They're not tied to a person, they're shared. And so if somebody uses them, we can see that they've been used, but we don't necessarily know by whom. And so when any organization that's going down the path of managing privilege, this is usually where they start. Because all of these credentials, if you don't have a solution in place, sit in a spreadsheet or they sit in some shared repository. Now, the next type of account, we'll spend more time talking about this today when we get to the DevOps side, is around application accounts. Right? So the first two are never used unless a human's using them. This last one is used by applications. So I'll give you some examples. If anybody is a ServiceNow customer, or a Tenable, or Rapid7, or Qualys, one of these organizations, they're doing things like discovery or vulnerability management. To do those actions, you need privilege. You need credentials to log into systems. In ServiceNow's case, I'm going to log into systems looking for configuration items. I'm going to use those configuration items and load it up into ServiceNow. That requires privilege. Now, no human's ever using them, but the application is. So who's tracking that? Who's managing that? Do we want to have these credentials hard-coded in code or in applications? Another example might be that developer that's building something. They're going to, and I wouldn't say, I don't want to generalize, but very commonly they're going to have hard-coded credentials in source code or scripts. The problem with that is if I get into that source code or I get into that script, well then obviously I can see that password and then I can impersonate that application, right? And so now that we know what a privileged account is generally, why is it important? Well, it's important because if you look at the vast number of breaches that are out there, privilege is at the center of them. So if we walk through how an attack typically takes place, I'm going to start with some type of phishing campaign, right? It might be spear phishing or something along those lines. I'm then going to land on your endpoint, going to establish persistence, trying to escalate privilege, harvest credentials, etc., and then move laterally around the environment. I can't do that without privilege. So I believe it was Forrester a couple years ago, in their analysis, 100% of breaches that they evaluated had privilege, right? And so I'll give a few, kind of interesting examples. So, maybe I land on, an HR person's endpoint. I get them to click on a link, right? And so when they do that, I have access to their endpoint. Maybe that doesn't matter to me. Maybe I don't care about their credentials. I care about somebody else's. But there's no credentials for me to harvest. What might I do to try to get somebody else to log in to get additional credentials? Well, I might do something like fill up their C drive, right? And over time, I'll fill up their C drive until they call the service desk. And then somebody else logs into that system to try to resolve the issue. And then bang, I have a credential. And that service desk analyst is going to have far more privilege than what that HR person has. And so I can use that credential now move laterally to other systems in the environment. So I was at RSA a couple years back and somebody came up to the booth asking about CyberArk, and so they gave an example of a red team, that exercise they had going on. So in this situation, what had happened is they hired a red team. The red team was sitting there for 3 hours. They waited for a vulnerability management tool to do its scan. The service account that was used for that was a domain admin. They grabbed the hash of that account, and they had domain administrative privileges within 3 hours, right? So this is typically how the attack lifecycle would work. Now, that does not change when we move to the cloud, right? Nothing really changes except some users are going to have even more privilege, right? So if I were to get onto an endpoint that's a developer workstation, and that developer has CLI or programmatic access into AWS or to Azure or any cloud provider, that key, depending on the provider, is going to be stored locally. If I can grab that key, I can now impersonate that developer. Does that make sense? Okay. This is what this might look like. I talked about application accounts. So this is, if you were to go to GitHub and just type in, whatever parameter you want to, AWS access key, and look at the latest commits and start, it might take you a little while to find one, but you will find credentials without doubt. CSO Online, they did a scan. They found over 200,000 credentials sitting in GitHub in public repositories just by doing automated scans, right? So it's still a really, really big problem. It also might look like this. So this is Jenkins. For those of you who aren't familiar, Jenkins basically is used for continuous integration. It's going to automate a lot of different steps in the software development lifecycle. And so in this situation, there's simply hard-coded credentials in this build job, right? And so I'm going to talk a lot about this in a little bit, because when we talk about DevOps, when we talk about security within DevOps, a lot of people are thinking about at the code level, but they're not thinking about necessarily the infrastructure that powers that pipeline. Real world examples, and everybody's probably familiar with some of these examples, but to kind of nail it home a little bit. So Uber and OneLogon, build this out. So essentially what happened with Uber is an Uber engineer, and from what I understand, they're pretty smart, pushed a commit and pushed code to GitHub, but they thought they were pushing it to a private repository and it was actually public. And so as a result, those credentials were exposed, and those credentials were used to essentially hold the organization at ransom for a $100,000 payment. Now, there was a lot of fallout as a result of that because it wasn't really disclosed that this had happened and the customers are impacted. But again, this is, reason why I call this slide out is because when we have conversations like this, when we talk about how privilege is the center of the life cycle and it's coming from a vendor, you're okay, you're trying to sell a product, I totally get it. But it's actually happening. Like, it is a real issue and it's a real problem. Now, show of hands, so what do you think the multiplier is? For every single user or employee in your organization, how many privileged accounts do you think there are? 1x, 1-to-1, 2-to-1? Anybody have any ideas? Not that high. Well, you're getting crazy. It's 3-to-1. 3-to-1. Yeah. You don't get the prize. Or maybe close. No, so it's 3-to-1, and it can be dramatically more depending on the nature of the business. If I'm in utilities and I have a ton of substations all over the place and I have all these OT devices, okay, now it starts to get more exponential. Working with a large organization, relatively close, that has 30,000 employees, and from their inventory is 119,000 privileged accounts. It's a huge problem. Now, not all of them are created equal, right? Some are going to be more risky than others. And so the rule of thumb I'd like to say is, if you have business continuity plans in your organization or disaster recovery plans in your organization to bring online systems that are critical to your business, those are probably accounts worth managing. Those are probably systems that you want to have additional controls on. Okay? Now, we know it's a problem. We see there's breaches that take place with privilege all the time. But when you start looking at the way businesses are shifting, like moving to DevOps to either maintain or gain competitive advantage and iterating really quickly and releasing as fast as possible to give value back to employees or value back to customers, it's a kind of alarming where 75% of organizations have no strategy around privileged access for DevOps. 50% have no strategy around privileged access for cloud. Right? So those are pretty large numbers. And so we talked about what privileged accounts are, we talked about the infrastructure. I want to spend some time talking about what that actually means. What is privileged access management, privileged account management, privileged identity management? You hear all these different terms. I'm going to start saying PAM because I'm getting tired of saying the same three words over and over. So if I'm going to deploy a PAM solution or a PAM program, just like anything else, it's going to be a blend of people, process, and technology. And so what is the technology? Like, what does it actually do for the organization? Well, when you first deploy a PAM solution, step one is obviously going to be inventory and lockdown credentials. We want to know what credentials are out in the wild that are, I would say, more risky or would be more impactful if something were to go wrong. We're going to inventory those and we're going to lock them down. So what does that mean? Well, that means we want to take those credentials away from your high-level administrators, and we might want to vault them, or we might want to control them in a solution. And what this means is we have auditing as to who's doing what with that credential. It might be checked in, it checked out. They're rotated automatically, so after that Tenable scan or that ServiceNow Discovery scan does its scan, we want to rotate that credential immediately, so we invalidate the hashes that are left behind from that scan, so people can't take and use and abuse those credentials. Right? Now, if we were to stop here, and a lot of organizations do. A lot of organizations say, I don't want a spreadsheet anymore because I know that's not the right thing, but we want to have some centralized system to put passwords in. If you've done that, awesome. You're in a lot better spot than a lot of organizations I work with. But if you stop there, then there's other complications that come into play. If we're just using a repository for storage, I can then conceivably come in and click show password or look at it, and then I've just taken it out of the system. Right? So now it's bypassing all these controls and all this technology you've put in place. Right? So we want to give users a way to use these credentials. And there's a lot of different solutions that are out there. Microsoft has privileged access workstations, or PAWS, I think they call it. A lot of different technologies or ways to isolate and control sessions. But that's the next step, is allowing individuals to use these privileged accounts in such a way that isn't detriment to their day-to-day operations. Right? So instead of going and clicking show password and then copying it into something, maybe I'm clicking connect and I'm connecting to a target. Right? And from there, then you can start actually understanding what users are doing. Some solutions will do complete video recording. Some will do keystroke capturing and allow you to look for suspicious behavior. Right? Now, the next step is just continuously monitoring. So I mentioned that if we know we have BCP systems or DRP systems or very privileged accounts, even if you don't have any other technology today, almost everybody has some type of logging mechanism, a SIM solution, a syslog server, something. Utilize that. Create rules to say if somebody's using or logging into the specific critical asset, set a flag, set a rule on that. If you're using Jenkins or some type of CI/CD tool, and you've created service accounts in your organization, analyze how the behavior of that service account, and then if it goes outside of that behavior, alert on it. Pay attention from a privileged point of view what's actually happening in the organization. Now, I think we have an okay understanding as to what a privileged account is, what a solution might do, and some of the problems with privileged accounts. So now I want to take those concepts and apply them to the cloud. So I'll pause. Any questions so far? As everybody kind of lowers their head and shifts their eyes down? No? Okay. Yes?
So what about the existing service account? Those are already there typed with so many different systems.
Yeah. So the question was, what about existing service accounts? And so there's a lot of organizations that have been around a long time, and they've had so much churn, maybe not necessarily churn, but they've had so many different solutions come through, and they've had a requirement of building a service account or creating a service account that's being used by multiple systems. So what happens when you're already at that state? How do you come back from that? Well, I'd say, the first thing you want to do is you want to inventory, right? You want to know if you have service accounts today, where they're being used, and that's a pretty tricky thing to do. So my recommendation is almost every single solution out there, every single vendor is going to have a discovery tool of some sort. Use them all. See which one you like best. Figure it out. You do a scan, you'll find a dependency. If I see a domain credential on the environment that Windows services or scheduled tasks are using, then I want to map that, at least have an inventory, because when I talk to organizations, they'll say, don't touch this thing, because if you touch it, we don't know what's going to break. So the first step is inventory. Once you feel like you have a decent baseline or an inventory, well, then the next step is, okay, let's touch it. Let's see what happens, right? Okay, does that answer your question? Yeah, inventory first. Okay. Now, cloud and SaaS applications, right? So I said, how does this apply to the cloud? There's one of these things that doesn't look like the other, and I'll explain that one first. Social media. Okay, so a lot of organizations, and you'd be surprised, I do get called in sometimes from marketing, like marketing departments saying, we don't necessarily know who has access to our Twitter account. It's kind of a big deal if you're marketing, right? And we hear about those hijacks all the time, because that can be real dollars and cents in terms of reputational loss, right? We don't know who has access to Facebook. These, if your organization is doing any social media or any marketing, these are very privileged credentials. It doesn't seem like everybody neglects them, but these are very, very privileged credentials. When we talk to organizations, we talk about privilege, everybody thinks about the IT guy sitting behind his keyboard. Like, it can be so much more than that. It can be the financial analysts that are sitting there using a shared password as they're going into banking websites, and they're all using a spreadsheet on their desk. Those are really privileged. Those are something that somebody might be interested in. Okay, so let's get more to the more traditional, what we think of PAM solutions. So I'll say SaaS and web applications, just like I said before with social media, privilege doesn't end, or doesn't just only resonate on cloud platforms. If you think about, I'm with a vendor, right? And for us, we sell software. We have relationships with customers. We use software to power that business. If that software was down or that software was not functional, that's critical. If you're in HR and you can't get into success factors, or there's any type of billing issues and you're using a SaaS-based solution, this is a big deal, right? This is still a very privileged system and should be managed. Just because it's a SaaS application subscribing to it doesn't mean you didn't get a privileged account when you first signed up. Right? And who has access to that account, and how are we watching what they're doing? Now, on the cloud platform side, let's dive in a little bit. So if you're to do anything on the cloud, I'm going to give you 4 kind of things just to go and start asking questions about. So step 1 would be going back to your teams and saying, okay, who has access to the cloud console? Right? When I subscribe to AWS, I have a root credential. When I subscribe to Azure, I have global administrator accounts. Who has access to those? Where are they saved? Because people shouldn't be using these credentials unless that's a true need to do so. Once you create your subscription to these services, you should then create the appropriate elevated personal or elevated privilege credentials and give rights to those accounts. And people should only be using those and only these super powerful credentials at time of need, right? Rather than just continue to use it once they've subscribed to it. So lock and vault those. Everything I talked about securing it, putting these credentials in a secure repository and checking them out, it applies to those types of credentials. All right. Now the next step is I talk about clicking connect and connecting to something, so there's session management. So take a step back on why we do session management and why we always recommend to go through a jump server or some type of proxy solution when I'm connecting to an asset. The real reason for that is if I have the credentials and I type it into the website or I type it in the domain controller on my endpoint, and my endpoint is compromised, and there's any type of keystroke logging taking place, they now have access to that credential. And so the reason why I always recommend session isolation is when I click connect, that solution injects the password on your behalf. So even if your endpoint is compromised, it doesn't matter. And that's also extremely critical for any organizations that have third-party vendors, because you can't really trust their endpoint. You know, they'd be coming in with their own device, and you don't have any type of posture compliance. Does that make sense? Nodding? Awesome. Okay. IAM accounts, that makes sense. So the next thing I'd say is every single cloud provider is going to have their own nuances. I picked AWS STS because I probably deal with that the most. My role is across North America. Canada I find really concentrated in Azure. In the US I find it very concentrated in AWS. So AWS has a really cool feature about temporary security credentials, right? The ability to grant temporary access to the console, so I don't have to give permanent access to a user. Always leverage these type of capabilities. Even if it's not necessarily intuitive, always leverage things like that. So we are giving just-in-time access, not full rights to something for an extended period of time. Okay. So step one, go ask who has access to the cloud consoles, who has access to CLI, where do those credentials live? You know, is it in Joe's spreadsheet that he keeps on his desktop? The next thing is protection of the identity provider. So if you're doing any type of synchronization of identities from on-prem to the cloud, and I picked on ADFS here because a lot of organizations are leveraging Active Directory Federation services. This solution must be treated like a tier 0 asset. Like this is just as critical as a domain controller. If somebody can get onto this system and get the private key, they can forge identities. Like that's kind of a big deal. And sometimes we work with organizations. We'll find that, you know, the Windows guy was tasked with building this thing off the side of their desk. And to be fair, he did the best they could, but didn't follow Microsoft's, and Microsoft has great recommendations on how to secure these, but didn't follow Microsoft's best practices of minimize the number of agents that are on that system, right, to reduce the attack surface, minimize the number of privileged users that can get onto that system, you know, lock it down through session isolation and management, which I spoke about before. And anytime anybody touches that system, make sure all logging is sent off so we can capture that in our SIM solution or syslog server. Okay. Now, protection of API keys. So if I'm going to AWS and I want to give programmatic access, I can generate a key, give that off, and it's like set and forget. And so that key gets put in code, it gets put in scripts, it gets put in a build execution in Jenkins, and nobody really thinks about it again, from my experience. Anytime you give one of these keys out, there should be a strategy around it, right? We should be thinking, how do we want to manage this key going forward? When is it rotated? Now, how frequently should we be rotating this key, right? All of these things need to be considered, and again, we can only consider them if we provide a way for our developers to use these types of credentials in a frictionless way, right? So if we're saying we need to rotate this key, you're certainly never going to go to a developer and say it's a manual effort, especially if they're subscribed to the DEVOPS and they're following that type of pattern. You'll be kicked out of the room. So we need to give them a way to securely retrieve credentials at time of need. And what this does is it allows us to change these credentials on the back end without impacting their code, right? And I'll talk a bit more about that when we get to secrets management. Now the next thing is managing privilege in the cloud is tricky given the dynamic nature of the workloads that are in there, right? If I have auto scaling or I'm doing, I'm spinning things up and spinning it down through any type of automation or orchestration, if we think about how a traditional organization would onboard, EC2 instances into a privileged account management solution, it might be through something like scanning. So I'm going to scan our cloud environment on a daily or weekly basis, looking for servers or systems that are sitting inside AWS. Well, that's great, but what happens if you're doing a weekly scan and that system is up on Monday and down on Wednesday and you scan every Sunday? You have no record from a privileged point of view that ever happened, right? Now the other way you might say is, okay, well, we do a lot of automation in the organization, so we'll just use the APIs that are provided by the PAM vendor and by your cloud provider, and as we spin something up, we're automatically going to secure that credential and then do rotation. And again, sounds really good, but what happens if somebody goes in the console and automatically or manually creates one and follows outside of that automation? You wouldn't see it, right? And if you try to do both, then you get duplicative work, right? You're going to get duplication in the system. So the right way to do this is through something like event automatic driven onboarding, right? Or event-driven automatic onboarding. So what this means is you have capabilities in almost every identity provider that allows serverless, right? So this is just one example. There's reference code here. Adopt it to whatever you want. But just to walk through what this means is the cloud provider is generating logs as things are taking place. We're capturing those logs. And so as a new EC2 instance is spun up, CloudWatch is going to see that. We're going to capture it. And then we're going to kick off a Lambda function, which is serverless. That's going to allow us to programmatically onboard and vault the credential. And on the flip side, if it gets removed, then we're going to automatically capture that and offboard the credential. And this is a way from a PAM solution point of view, we get visibility. And again, you might not have any solution today. You might have no plans to get it. But you should be looking at CloudWatch. You should be monitoring these types of logs for when instances are spun up and spun down. So you at least have an idea of what's happening in your cloud. Because I find that is sometimes completely lost in the picture. Folks are focused on on-premise. Does that make sense so far? Cool. I don't see too many food comas yet. I was expecting to see a lot of people just like passed out from sandwiches and that. Okay. One call to action thing I'd always recommend is just go to our GitHub. It's a free little utility. Works with Azure and AWS. And all you do is just run it against your it's all PowerShell, so you can look at all the code, obviously. You just run it against your cloud environment. And what it does is look for things like shadow admins. And so what a shadow admin is essentially, they're not, the user isn't added to the administrator group, but through the way nesting has taken place, or it might not be explicitly called out that they have this level of privilege, but they do if you look through the nesting and the group memberships they have inherent, right? The other thing is just going to give you, I would say, a quick, at a glance view as to how your users have been created. Do they have MFA? Are passwords being rotated? These sorts of things. And again, this all comes back to the inventorying part of things, right? You need to know what you have before you can do anything about it. Okay. Anything on the cloud aspect of things? There's, I could dive into cloud, and it's probably like an hour-long conversation, but I was given not as much time. So, any questions, comments? Okay. So if you have any developers in your organization, it probably looks something like this. You're going to have a blend of technology. You're going to have, Ansible for configuration management, right? Where you're pushing code changes or you're pushing configuration changes to systems within your environment. Likely you have Jenkins or something like that from a CI point of view. If you're doing any type of containerization, it's usually universally Kubernetes, right, for orchestration of containers. The thing is if we want to work in an agile environment, we need to rely on automation, as much automation as possible. We know we can't do anything manual. The problem with that now is for automation, the applications and the code are the privileged users, right? They're the ones logging into all the systems. They're the one executing the tasks. And who's watching them? This is like the start of Skynet, right? This is the robots are taking over. Because from my experience, folks are, again, focused on the identities, so the elevated personal users and understanding what they're doing, their elevated privileged accounts, but they're not really looking at, hey, we created this service account for Jenkins or created a service account for whatever, and we're seeing that as doing something abnormal. Now, in my last organization, so I come from an operational background, we used a discovery tool, and we basically the purpose of our discovery is just to understand, do a hardware inventory essentially across our environment. And you'd be surprised what you see when you start looking for these service accounts and what they're doing. Really, really basic issue, it wasn't even a huge problem, but it was worth a conversation, is we had an account that had elevated privileges for discovery. Now, I'd say we were a little bit lazy in that we didn't do proper credential boundaries and say, okay, this account can only do these things. We gave it a lot of privilege so we didn't have to do a lot of work. So let's give this account a domain admin credential. And if we had to change the password, let's set it to non-expiring because it takes too much effort to go to all these systems and change it. Argue with the security team, get the exception, perfect. And I'm sure all of you guys have it. You're shaking your head at me, but I know you guys have some of these. Anyway, so they started monitoring that account. And they found that account was used very frequently by the team to reset their _admin account. So if they forgot the password, they would just go into, I don't want to say the name, but it was like an Excel spreadsheet essentially. And they'd go in there, they'd grab their credential, they'd open up Active Directory users' computers with that account, they reset their password to something new because they just didn't want to call the service desk. They just couldn't be bothered. Right? So you'd be very surprised at how some of these accounts are actually being used when you start looking at them and start interrogating them. Now, when we talk about application credentials generally, there's always a few challenges, right? One, if we're storing them hard-coded, it means let's be honest, we're never going to change them. Like nobody's actually going to change a ticket in to go in and crack open code or go through scripts and manually do anything. They never will. And as a security team, you can ask them to, and you can say, okay, fine, but every year you have to go through there. And what they'll do, at least what I did, is I would say it's too much business risk. And then I go to my management, and that management goes to that management, and they go back and forth, and then I get an exception, right? And then we talk about it next year, and we do the dance again. Hopefully there's a different security person. So, you're not going to change them. So I just actually worked with an organization down in the US that had an audit, and they had, it was actually pretty neat. It was like a trading application, and so all these different systems, and built in C++, and they failed their audit because they had hard-coded credentials through everything. Right? So as they went through their audit, and it was a subsidiary of a very large organization, so they failed their audit. So this is a huge issue for them. Another example is a very, very large airline in the US had an issue where all of their, like if you think about an airline is obviously transportation, but it's also kind of e-commerce, right? You go to a website and you order tickets and all that. And so for them, at Christmas time, at different times of the year, they would scale up or scale down based on need. And so their web tier had hard-coded credentials that allowed the web tier to communicate back to the app tier. So another situation with audit. So you see that a lot. Now, does anybody know what RPA is? Robotic Process Automation? Yeah, see, the bots are taking over. So RPA is really a way to simulate user behavior in an automated fashion, right? It's a really efficient way to, I'd say, minimize operational costs. But if you're going to simulate a user, then it needs a high level of privilege to do so. So now it's just more privileged accounts being used, right? Now, let's talk about an example. So before I do this, when we talk about, you see DevSecOps, you see security and DevOps and all that sort of stuff. Yeah, secure coding principles and vulnerability management and dynamic analysis and static analysis and all that stuff in your code, of course. But when we start asking the question, like who has access to Kubernetes? Who has access to Jenkins? These things have built-in credentials. Where do they sit? And if I did get on one, what could I see? Nobody really talks about that. It's about the code. Rightly so, but there's still a whole piece that's missing. So as an example, this is Tesla Cloud. It was disclosed, obviously. Had Kubernetes. They had no password on the Kubernetes console. Somebody logged in to that. They put their AWS access keys in there because obviously Kubernetes needs to communicate with AWS. Somebody got in, just open door, and the hard-coded credentials sitting right there for AWS. So they used that, and they used it for cryptocurrency mining. Tesla they weren't the ones to discover it. Redlock discovered it, and Redlock informed them. And the people that did it were quite intelligent. They didn't use an IP address that was blacklisted or anything. They used one that wasn't, and they just kept going until Redlock informed them. Right? So again, might have had the most secure coding practices in the world, but the door is wide open. Somebody could just walk right in. Now, developers will try to do the right thing. You've given the opportunity, obviously. And every single solution is going to have some type of repository for credentials. The problem is all of those repositories are bolt-ons. If you actually look through the life cycle of a lot of these, Vault wasn't released right when Ansible first came out. These were a business problem saying, hey, we don't want to have hard-coded credentials in playbooks. We don't have hard-coded credentials in different things. So what we should do is we should create a little repository for our users to use so they don't have to hard-code things. The problem is they weren't built with security in mind. They're built with function in mind, right? So if you look at some of these, the default encryption is base 64 encoding. It's not encrypting anything. It's just there for storage reasons. Not only that, as an organization, when you start talking about privilege, and if you're not getting, your organization doesn't get audited on a regular basis, you don't have a lot of compliance standards, privilege is a real thing. You will see this a lot. When somebody asks you the question, can you show me how Jenkins was used, or show me what this account did in your environment? When you have these little islands of security with their own audit logging, their own standards, their own everything, that's a really hard question to answer. Right? So what everybody is looking for is kind of a unified, we have a single pane of glass or a single picture as to what we can see. Now, I kind of want to leave you guys with just I'd say 3 key, for me anyway, when I have conversations with developers and they know security background and I'm part of a vendor, they usually don't want to talk to me, and I totally get it because they think it's going to be like a friction type of experience. So for those of you that are in a security role in this room and you want to talk to developers, and you want to try to get them understanding what privilege is, I want to give you 3 key items that you can go to them with. And just ask them questions. And some actionable things that you can take when you go back to your organizations. Okay, so first thing, when working with the development team, I'd always say transform. They're not, like, developers aren't going to change. They're the ones driving business value, right? They're the ones creating the applications that customers and employees are consuming. And they need to do it as quickly as possible. And so asking them to go to a manual process or asking them to do something that's going to impede what they're trying to do is never going to work. And you won't be invited to the room anymore. So you need to start, it's almost self-reflection. So it's understand what DevOps is. Go by the Phoenix project, right? Go online. There's YouTube videos. Just go and understand at least what DevOps is, so you can have a basic conversation and understand some of the tools and techniques. You don't need to be an expert on Docker, but if somebody says containers, you shouldn't go cross-eyed, right? If somebody talks to you about a REST API, even if you're in security, you should know what that means. Like a very basic PowerShell, very basic Python, you should be able to have a conversation and credibly be able to communicate the issues that you see from a security point of view in terms that they're comfortable with. Because I can guarantee you they're not going to use terms that you're comfortable with. Okay, now next thing is make it easy for the developers to do the right thing. So we talked about this before. If you have that island of security model where you have solutions there that people can pull credentials from, and you don't have a PAM solution, like that's good. At least they're doing that. Don't let them do the hard-coded credentials thing. We know that's not a good thing. But use some type of source. You're not hard-coding anything anywhere. If you do have a solution, doesn't matter what it is, if there's APIs available to it, go to your developer and say, hey, our solution has APIs that allow you to pull this credential automatically. You don't need to hard-code it, because they might not be aware of that. And when you show them that, they're far more likely to do it, because nobody wants to hard-code anything anywhere if they can help it. Okay? Now, the other thing that I would always recommend is when you sit down and you start having the conversation, start brokering privileged access, ask questions like, if I had your credentials, what could I do? What harm could I do to the organization? If I had access to Jenkins, what would I see? What could I do? Get them to start thinking in such a way like if they were compromised, and by the way, let them know that they're targets, right? Because as they're building software, it's your lifeblood to the organization, depending on what you do. It's all your intellectual property, absolutely targets. And they need to be aware of that. So start having that conversation. There's actually a really good, this is sponsored by CyberArk. This white paper, you might not see it, but it's CISO View, DevOps, and Cloud. It's about 26 pages long. It goes into a lot of detail on all these things, right? Different questions to ask, all these sorts of things. Okay. Adopt DevOps and Agile methodologies in security. So what does that actually mean? So that means, if you're a security professional and you want to have advanced logging on systems that you don't have today, instead of doing it manually or asking the Windows team or whomever to do it for you, try to build it yourself in Ansible. Try to learn the tools that they're using today to do what they do. Store the source code the same way they would, and it's going to give you a greater appreciation for what they have to do day to day. Does that make sense? Yeah? Cool. All right. Prioritize securing DevOps tools and infrastructure. So we've already talked about this. But it's, first I would inventory what you have, right? As a security person, you're not going to go in there and say, hey, by the way, you shouldn't be using this. It's not secure. You shouldn't be using that. Again, they just won't show you anything. They won't tell you anything. And know that what they have today may dramatically change tomorrow based on different use cases or based on interests. You might hire somebody that, I used to do this in my last company. It was really awesome. We're going to do it here. And also that's a new standard. It's important to understand what you have. I would take that back and start looking at some of the security capabilities of what they're using, like the Jenkins and everything else. And then I would get yourself a seat at the table to at least evaluate what comes next. So, okay, we're looking at containerization. Awesome. Are you guys looking at Kubernetes? Yeah, we're playing with it in a sandbox using like Minikube or something like this. So, okay, awesome. So start doing your research and then start coming back with an informed conversation. Okay, well, if we're going to deploy that in the organization, we need to do the following things to make it secure, right? The other thing is those built-in credentials that they're using to deploy, it's where are they stored, who has access to them, how are they being rotated. Please put a password in Kubernetes, reference Tesla Cloud. And then the next thing I'd say is, it's kind of one and the same. Tightly control, when I say DevOps tools, I mean, it's like things like Ansible as well, even though it's not the, I would say, pure DevOps tool, but things like Ansible. So if I have access to Ansible, I can write a playbook that puts in a minute credential on every single host in the environment. That's a big deal, right? It takes no time to do. So again, who has access to Ansible? How are we tracking when somebody logs in? How are we managing configuration changes? Now, for those existing code repositories that you have in your environment, just if you don't have access already, just do a casual scan. Work with the developers. See if there is any hard code credentials. Ask questions. You know, when I work with security teams, there's such a wall in terms of privileged access that we don't even know the right questions to ask sometimes. Now, last thing I'd leave you with is just don't let too much technical debt take hold. And so what this means is I've worked with companies that they've had some extremely smart people, like extremely smart individuals that just want to build their own thing. You know, I can build this myself. And then, you know, Jim leaves, and who's running this thing now? And so kind of get in front of this when this is happening. If you can, if there is any centralized solution, and almost everybody has some type of solution they can use, if there is anything else that makes sense, use that. You know, don't let them use the Kubernetes secrets and the Ansible Vault and all these other things. If there is some way to take advantage of a centralized repository, do it, because as a security professional, it's going to make a huge difference to you. Now, I already mentioned this a few different times, but I want to hammer it home, is for all the service accounts that you're creating and all the service accounts you don't even know about, do your inventories and start changing your monitoring strategy on these accounts. Actively look for them. And then the last thing is, if there is any source code that has hard-coded credentials, try to find the absolute, you know, the easiest way for you to remove them without having, you know, the developers give you a lot of grief for it. There's always going to be a solution, whether it's built into one of the tools themselves or a REST API somewhere. There's likely free software out there, something, but look to do something rather than having them hard-coded. Now I want to pause here and just any questions, comments, concerns? Silence. Perfect. All right, folks. Well, thank you so much for the time. Appreciate it.